For decades, audiences have assumed that the tools behind filmmaking, from lighting to sound design, are simply artistic instruments meant to shape mood and narrative. But hidden in the margins of Hollywood's technical history is another story, one where certain directors pushed their craft so far into untested sensory territory that the industry quietly stepped back. Long before digital precision smoothed the edges of modern cinema, filmmakers experimented with volatile blends of analog light pulses, experimental audio frequencies, and distorted motion techniques that reached deeper into human perception than anyone anticipated. Some of these methods were subtle enough that viewers never realized what affected them: small disruptions in rhythm, low vibrations built into sound beds, or visual patterns that danced at the thresholds of detection. Yet the body reacted anyway. Reports from premiere screenings described dizziness, inexplicable waves of unease, or the feeling that the film was exerting pressure rather than simply being watched. These reactions were rarely publicized. Studios preferred to avoid scrutiny, especially when no clear explanation existed beyond "the audience responded strangely." Each time a technique caused concern, the pattern repeated. A film debuted, viewers felt something they couldn't articulate, executives held closed-door discussions, and the method disappeared, not with a public announcement but with silent avoidance. Over time, these vanished experiments formed a hidden chapter of sci-fi history, one defined not by creative failure but by techniques deemed too psychologically potent to use again. In this episode, we revisit 15 films born from that forgotten frontier. Some manipulated light in ways that overwhelmed the eye. Others used sound to engage the nervous system directly. A few blurred the line between cinematic illusion and sensory interference. All revealed what happens when storytelling intersects with the raw mechanics of human perception. And their disappearance leaves a lingering question. Did Hollywood abandon these techniques for safety, or because they worked too well? 1. The Last Starfighter, 1984. The Last Starfighter broke new ground in computer-generated imagery, but the novelty of early CGI brought unintended consequences that Hollywood quickly learned to avoid. Because rendering technology was still developing, motion sequences involving high-speed ships and rapid rotations produced distortions known as velocity smear. These distortions caused objects to stretch or ghost across frames when motion exceeded the system's sampling ability. To the viewer, this created an unnatural warping brief, but noticeable enough to disrupt spatial coherence. Audience reactions were subtle but consistent. Some viewers felt mild nausea during intense flight scenes. Others described a fleeting sense that the image had snapped or misaligned. Technicians analyzing these responses discovered that motion smear interfered with the brain's ability to track velocity smoothly. When expectation and visual input diverged, even slightly, the effect produced physiological discomfort. Universal Studios took these findings seriously. Internal technical documents from the period labeled high-velocity CGI as unstable for theatrical precision, prompting rapid improvements in rendering algorithms. Developers were instructed to prioritize motion stability over visual experimentation, effectively eliminating the conditions that produced the original distortions. While modern viewers rarely encounter these artifacts due to remastering, the film's first release demonstrated a critical insight. Digital imagery, when pushed too far, could unintentionally stress the perceptual mechanisms that maintain spatial orientation. Hollywood quietly shifted towards safer CGI strategies, ensuring that velocity-driven distortion would never again appear in wide-release films. The Last Starfighter remains a milestone, but beneath its pioneering legacy lies a cautionary tale about the neurological limits of early digital motion limits the industry learned not to cross again. 2. Sunshine, 2007. Sunshine sought to portray the sun not merely as a celestial body, but as an overwhelming force capable of penetrating the human psyche. To convey this, director Danny Boyle utilized controlled overexposure surges, brief, intense expansions of light, designed to mimic the feeling of staring into something unimaginably powerful. These surges occurred not randomly, but at narrative pressure points, amplifying emotional intensity through abrupt visual shock. Screening reactions revealed how potent the technique was. Many viewers instinctively shielded their eyes, others felt disoriented as their vision struggled to recover from rapid luminance spikes. Some described a sensation akin to heat or weight pressing through the screen. Specialists reviewing the footage noted that these surges bordered on the thresholds used in sensory overstimulation experiments. producing momentary disruption in the eye's adaptation mechanisms. Executives at Fox Searchlight recognized both the artistic brilliance and the potential hazard. Brightness surges varied significantly depending on theater configuration, making the effect difficult to control. To mitigate risk, several scenes were adjusted in post-production to soften the transitions. Internal memos from the studio urged caution with any future use of aggressive overexposure, citing the unpredictable physiological responses recorded during testing. While the final film still harnesses the sun's overwhelming presence, its most extreme surges were toned down, ensuring they remained expressive without provoking distress. Hollywood ultimately moved away from similar luminance-based intensity techniques, favoring digital simulations that could maintain visual impact without threatening sensory overload. Sunshine's legacy demonstrates how a single visual element, light, pushed to its limits, can alter the viewer's physical experience. And it showed the industry where the boundary lies between cinematic immersion and perceptual strain. Donnie Darko, 2001. Donnie Darko became iconic for its dreamlike tension and looping timelines, but beneath its psychological narrative lay a nearly invisible visual device that shaped how audiences emotionally processed the film. Director Richard Kelly introduced slow, rhythmic luminance fluctuations, subtle alterations in brightness that drifted across the image at intervals too soft to be recognized consciously. These fluctuations appeared specifically during scenes involving temporal distortion or moments when reality seemed to thin around Donnie, lending the film its unsettling aura. During early screenings, viewers struggled to articulate what bothered them. Some felt a faint pressure around their temples, others experienced momentary imbalance or a sensation of watching the scene from a distance. These reactions were traced back to the brightness drifts, which disrupted the eye's adaptation cycle. Instead of stabilizing to a consistent level of light, the viewer's visual system was forced to readjust repeatedly, creating a low-grade disorientation aligned perfectly with the film's themes. Studio reviewers raised concerns about the unpredictability of the technique. Because luminance modulation behaved differently depending on screen size and theater calibration, the intensity of the effect varied dramatically. Some theaters produced subtle unease, others risked overwhelming sensitive viewers. To avoid potential backlash, the studio recommended softening the effect, though Kelly retained enough modulation to preserve the film's uncanny emotional tone. Hollywood quietly stepped away from similar brightness-driven manipulations afterward. Internal discussions framed such methods as sub-perceptual influence tools, cautioning that they could shape emotional states without viewers' awareness. As digital mastering advanced, luminance stability became a priority, effectively pushing techniques like this into obscurity. Donnie Darko's hypnotic mood endures, but part of its power originated from a visual rhythm Hollywood later decided was too psychologically invasive to repeat. 4. The Matrix, 1999. Before The Matrix reshaped action cinema, its early development stages produced a visual anomaly that studios never allowed to surface publicly. During initial bullet time tests, the effects team used synchronized strobing units positioned around the circular camera rigs to mark motion cues and align exposure. These strobes, when activated during rehearsals, bled into the prototype footage as sharp, rhythmic pulses. When projected, the pulses created a mesmerizing but disorienting halo effect that wrapped around the actors' movements like vibrating light. Test viewers struggled to process the footage. Some reported dizziness, while others felt as though the motion had separated into parallel layers. Technicians analyzing the responses noted that the strobe frequency inadvertently matched ranges known to disrupt the brain's motion coherence processing. Although visually striking, the effect risked overstimulating neural circuits responsible for tracking continuous movement. Warner Brothers stepped in immediately, ordering the removal of all strobe-based calibration in favor of stable LED tracking markers. Internal safety discussions emphasized that rhythmic pulses surrounding dynamic motion posed an unpredictable perceptual hazard. The studio acted before the issue could escalate, ensuring no strobe artifacts made it into the theatrical release. The polished bullet time shots that reached audiences were built on precision and smooth interpolation, but they concealed an earlier phase where the technique verged into neurological interference. Hollywood took note, and strobe-assisted motion capture was quietly discouraged across the industry. The Matrix ultimately became a cinematic milestone. Yet its abandoned strobe tests revealed how easily groundbreaking innovation can encroach on physiological thresholds the industry prefers not to cross. 5. Existence Z 1999. Existence Z blurred the boundaries between organic and digital reality, but its most unnerving technique operated not on the story level, but within the fabric of the image itself. Cronenberg's team experimented with a subtle form of spatial distortion, a controlled manipulation of motion edges and peripheral shapes designed to mimic the instability of entering an artificial world. Objects would drift microscopically off-axis, or movements would linger just slightly too long, producing a sensation that something was bending within the frame. These disturbances were quiet but deeply effective. Early viewers reported difficulty trusting their own sense of orientation, even in dialogue-heavy scenes. Others felt mild disassociation, as if the environment on screen were breathing or flexing. Post-production logs later noted that the distortion patterns interfered with the viewer's peripheral anchoring system, the mechanism that allows the brain to judge stability and spatial boundaries. Studio executives voiced private concerns. While the method was subtle, its unpredictability made it unsuitable for mass audiences. The distortions responded differently depending on projection format. On large screens, they became more pronounced, amplifying the discomfort. Hollywood began phasing out such techniques, labeling them perceptually volatile in internal communications. As digital effects matured, filmmakers sought cleaner, more controlled forms of visual manipulation. The organic distortions seen in Existence Z grew rare, replaced by safer, more predictable digital simulations that prevented unintended physiological responses. The film stands today as a reminder of how delicate the boundary is between visual artistry and sensory intervention. Cronenberg revealed that even small deviations in motion can alter a viewer's internal equilibrium, an insight powerful enough for Hollywood to quietly avoid repeating. 6. Event Horizon 1997. Event Horizon has built a reputation for its disturbing imagery, but the most unsettling element of the film wasn't what appeared clearly on screen, it was what flashed so quickly the conscious mind couldn't fully register it. During assembly of the film's chaotic vision of hell sequences, the editors inserted distorted frames of violence and grotesque transformation at sub-perceptual speed. These fleeting visuals lasted only a single frame or two, short enough to bypass deliberate recognition, but long enough to activate emotional reflexes buried beneath awareness. During test screenings, viewers reacted with inexplicable tension. Some felt sudden anxiety with no identifiable trigger. Others reported unease as if the film were pressing inward on them. Only when technicians reviewed the footage frame by frame did they realize that the subliminal inserts were prompting the brain to respond without context, stimulating fear centers directly, sidestepping conscious analysis altogether. Studio leadership recognized the power of the technique but recoiled from its implications. Subliminal imagery occupied a gray zone with no formal regulations, yet carried unpredictable consequences. Legal advisors warned that if audiences discovered the use of hidden frames, the studio might face criticism for manipulating viewers psychologically. The result was a mandate to scale back the most extreme sequences, though fragments remain in the final cut. Hollywood quietly distanced itself from subliminal horror afterward. Editors received informal guidance discouraging experimentation with subframe content, especially in emotionally charged scenes. While overt strobe effects could be monitored and controlled, subliminal frames were inherently unstable, too dependent on projection environment, screen size, and viewer sensitivity. Event Horizon endures as a cult classic, but part of its potency lies in a technique the industry chose not to revisit. It served as proof that cinema could reach beneath conscious thought, and that such power demanded restraint. 7. Tetsuo, the Iron Man, 1989. Tetsuo, the Iron Man is a cinematic assault, an industrial surge of metal, flesh, and relentless movement. But beyond its aesthetic chaos, the film pioneered a motion technique that proved too physiologically abrasive for mainstream adaptation. Director Shinya Tsukamoto fused stop-motion bursts with unstable handheld shots, producing motion rhythms that were neither fluid nor chaotic, but something in between, a deliberate disruption of the brain's motion prediction system. Exposure shifts and rapid camera snaps heightened this effect, making every transformation feel like a violent mechanical spasm. Audience reactions were intense and often physical. Viewers reported vertigo, stomach churning, and a sense that the room itself was trembling. Festival critics described the experience as sensory compression, as though the film were closing in on them. Visual analysts later noted that the frame cadence mimicked experimental stress patterns used in psychological testing structures designed to confuse spatial orientation and overwhelm the perceptual system. Hollywood treated Tetsuo as both a revelation and a warning. While the film's technique was undeniably innovative, it demonstrated how easily aggressive motion could bypass narrative and target the viewer's nervous system directly. Studios soon flagged unstable cadence structures as unsuitable for commercial environments, especially when combined with high-frequency exposure shifts. By the mid-1990 seconds, such motion hybrids had largely disappeared from professional cinematography guidelines. Tetsuo remains a cult phenomenon, revered for its visceral energy, but its technical legacy is one of caution. It showed that motion, when weaponized, can induce genuine physiological distress. The industry quietly stepped back, recognizing that certain sensory intensities belong not to mainstream cinema but to experimental extremes. 8. Akira, 1010-8811. Akira has been praised for decades as a masterwork of animated futurism, but its most powerful technique, rapid alternating light bursts, sparked concerns across international distribution networks. To communicate the explosive psychic forces tearing through Neo-Tokyo, animators used tightly spaced flash sequences, layering single-frame whiteouts between action frames. The result was a visual rhythm that hit the eye with abrupt intensity, simulating violent surges of energy in a way traditional animation rarely attempted. Initial audiences reacted strongly. Some viewers instinctively shielded their eyes, others experienced momentary dizziness or described a flash-like pressure behind their vision. Though reactions varied, enough reports surfaced for distributors to reconsider the film's projection parameters. Theater operators were quietly instructed to lower brightness or slightly adjust frame exposure, unofficial measures meant to soften the film's impact without altering the original prints. Hollywood observed this with caution. Rapid single-frame alternations had long been discussed in animation circles, but Akira's extreme implementation highlighted their physiological risks. Internal memos began urging studios to avoid aggressive light fluctuation patterns in theatrical releases, noting that they could provoke neurological responses disproportionate to their visual duration. What made Akira's technique so potent was its precision. The flashes weren't chaotic, but intentionally calibrated to mimic psychic rupture. This effectiveness became the very reason the industry stepped away from it. Animators recognized that repeating such aggressive rhythms could push audiences beyond the threshold of safe stimulation. Akira's influence remains enormous, but its most intense optical method, the blistering strobe sequences, has been quietly retired. The film stands as proof that animation can impact the nervous system as forcefully as live-action cinematography. 9 Tron, 1982. Tron is remembered today as a pioneering digital milestone, yet behind its glowing circuitry and virtual landscapes lay a technical accident that exposed just how sensitive human perception can be. The film was produced at a moment when analog and digital techniques were colliding, and many sequences required layering computer-generated images over traditionally photographed plates. This hybridization generated an unintended side effect: micro-intensity flicker patterns created when backlit animation frames merged imperfectly with early CGI renders. These fluctuations were subtle enough to escape casual notice, yet forceful enough to interrupt the viewer's visual stability. Test screenings provided the first warnings. Some viewers felt a vague wave of nausea during scenes heavy with neon geometry. Others described the image as vibrating, even though nothing on screen appeared to be shaking. Disney's technical audit revealed that the analog-digital composites produced flicker frequencies within the range known to cause perceptual strain, particularly in sequences where bright lines contrasted sharply with dark backgrounds. Although audiences embraced the film's innovation, Disney acted swiftly behind the scenes. Internal guidance labeled hybrid flicker a non-viable artifact, advising future productions to eliminate similar interactions. As the industry shifted toward fully digital pipelines, the unpredictable strobing effects of hybrid compositing vanished, not due to obsolescence alone, but because studios recognized how easily flicker could intrude into neurological territory. Modern restorations have scrubbed away most of these artifacts, softening the original film's perceptual intensity. Yet Tron's early experiments left an enduring lesson. In cinema, even the smallest technical irregularity can influence the body in ways no director intends. 10 Altered States 1980. Altered States pushed cinematic hallucination to new extremes, but beneath its surreal visions lay a flicker-based method that sparked concern among technicians and medical consultants alike. To simulate the protagonist's descent into primal consciousness, director Ken Russell employed high-contrast light bursts that cycled at rapid, uneven intervals. These bursts were crafted to overwhelm the viewer's perceptual stability, mimicking neural overload without relying on traditional strobe effects. During test screenings, reactions exceeded expectations. Some viewers reported dizziness or nausea, while others described moments of perceptual detachment as though their eyes lagged behind the film's visual rhythm. Specialists brought in by the studio noted that several flicker cycles fell squarely within frequencies known to disrupt neural synchronization, ranges typically avoided in public environments due to their potential to trigger neurological stress. While no formal regulatory action was taken, the studio grew uneasy about the liability risks associated with such intense sensory methods. Hollywood's internal memos from the era show increasing pressure to avoid flicker frequencies that could unpredictably affect portions of the audience. As digital effects evolved, filmmakers gravitated towards safer, more controllable visual languages, leaving behind the volatile analog flicker that powered Altered State's most iconic sequences. Despite revisions before release, the film retains enough of its original intensity to convey the sensation of consciousness unraveling. But its legacy is double-edged. It expanded the vocabulary of cinematic hallucination while simultaneously demonstrating that certain perceptual boundaries should not be crossed. Altered States stands as a landmark of experimental sci-fi and as a reminder that even artistic ambition must yield when sensory effects drift too close to neurological risk. Elf Eraserhead, 1977. Eraserhead is often framed as a surreal fever dream, yet much of its psychological intensity originated from a soundscape that subtly pushed audiences toward physical discomfort. Instead of relying on musical cues, David Lynch built a continuous sonic environment composed of metallic drones, mechanical rumblings, and layered hums operating at low frequencies. These sounds were designed not as accompaniment but as an oppressive atmosphere that pressed against the viewer's senses, producing tension even in scenes without dramatic events. Audience reactions revealed how powerful this approach could be. Some viewers reported a tightening in the throat or chest, while others described a vibration that seemed to emanate from within their bodies. The discomfort emerged not from volume but from the sustained presence of frequencies that lingered just above infrasonic levels. Sound engineers reviewing the film noted that the persistent tones interacted with the autonomic nervous system, triggering unease even when the viewer was unaware of the source. Hollywood took notice. While Lynch had not broken any technical guidelines, the unpredictable reactions made studios wary of allowing similar sound beds into wide-release productions. Concerns mounted as theater operators reported clusters of walkouts attributed not to the film's imagery, but to its suffocating acoustic presence. Internal discussions recommended avoiding prolonged, low-frequency environments in future films, citing their capacity to provoke involuntary physical responses. The technique was gradually phased out across the industry, replaced by more controlled approaches to atmospheric sound design. Yet Eraserhead remains an enduring example of how audio can influence the body as much as the mind. Its soundscape reshaped the boundaries of cinematic immersion and demonstrated why the industry stepped away from methods capable of bypassing conscious interpretation altogether. 12 Phase 4, 1974. Phase 4 stands as one of the most unusual science fiction films of its era, not only for its narrative but for the experimental optical method that quietly led Hollywood to retreat from similar attempts. Director Saul Bass collaborated with macrophotography specialists to capture extreme close-ups of insects and environmental textures under pulsing, asymmetrical lighting. These pulses were created by analog rigs that produced exposure shifts at inconsistent intervals, causing the imagery to oscillate between sharp clarity and sudden bursts of brightness. Because the camera magnified tiny movements, even slight lighting fluctuations became exaggerated, generating a visual rhythm that felt unnaturally alive. Screening responses were immediate and unsettled. Viewers reported eye strain, headaches, and a peculiar crawling sensation reactions far out of proportion to the slow, observational nature of the scenes. Some audience members instinctively looked away during the macro sequences, as if the imagery were activating a discomfort they couldn't articulate. Technicians who analyzed the footage later discovered that the irregular pulse cycles overlapped with luminance ranges known to provoke neurological fatigue. Studio leadership became concerned not because the imagery was graphic, but because its effects varied unpredictably between theater environments. Slight differences in projector brightness or screen contrast could amplify the pulses in ways no filmmaker could control. This unpredictability led internal advisors to label the technique inconsistent for safe theatrical presentation, effectively discouraging any future use. Bass defended the method as a way to convey the alien intelligence of the film's insects, but the industry had already made its decision. By the end of the decade, macro strobe experimentation vanished from mainstream cinema. Phase 4 remains a hypnotic curiosity, but buried within its visuals is a method that proved too volatile, too physiologically intrusive for Hollywood to revisit. 13. Solaris 1972. Solaris is often remembered for its quiet introspection, yet its emotional impact stemmed from a subtle technique that played directly with viewers' perception of time. Tarkovsky introduced irregular temporal cadence into several sequences, elongated shutter exposures, uneven frame repetition, and silent micropauses embedded within continuous movement. These adjustments were so slight that most viewers never consciously perceived them, but the brain did. The irregular rhythms interfered with the natural flow of motion processing, creating a drifting sensation that mirrored the film's themes of memory and uncertainty. Audience reactions at early screenings reflected this effect. Some viewers reported mild disorientation, not because of the story's philosophical weight, but because their internal sense of timing felt disrupted. Others mentioned that certain scenes seemed to float even when the camera remained perfectly still. Projection technicians who reviewed the sequences noted that the cadence variations created a perceptual instability akin to temporal parallax, an effect observed in psychological studies of altered states. Soviet officials questioned the technique's appropriateness, concerned that such subtle manipulation might be interpreted as an attempt to induce emotional vulnerability. European distributors echoed these concerns, citing viewer reports of dizziness during the highway sequence. Though no formal prohibition emerged, studios across multiple regions grew hesitant to pursue similar experiments. Tarkovsky insisted that cinema should reshape time as much as image, but modern research has since validated the physiological consequences of uneven cadence modulation. Even tiny disruptions in frame rhythm can affect orientation, anticipation, and emotional grounding. Solaris stands today as a masterpiece, but embedded within its contemplative beauty is a perceptual technique Hollywood quietly set aside. The film demonstrated how time itself could become an instrument of psychological influence, pushing cinema into territory most studios no longer dared to explore. 14. THX 11381971. THX 1138 is often praised for its minimalist world-building, but beneath its stark imagery was a deeper experiment involving the physiology of sound. Lucas and sound designer Walter Murch constructed an acoustic environment filled with layered mechanical resonance and infrasonic tones, not traditionally heard but physically felt. These frequencies blended seamlessly into the film's ambience, shaping the emotional atmosphere in ways most viewers never consciously recognized. Reports from early screenings described an unusual pattern of reactions. Viewers reported pressure in their chest, unease during otherwise calm scenes, or a lingering sense of being confined. Projectionists noticed that these complaints tended to surface during sequences where low-frequency beds intensified. When technical teams examined the mix, they confirmed that some frequencies dipped into ranges associated with autonomic responses, quickened heartbeat, shallow breathing, and heightened vigilance. Hollywood was intrigued but wary. The technique was not illegal, yet it blurred ethical boundaries by influencing the audience physiologically rather than emotionally. Studios feared that continued use of infrasonic layering could attract scrutiny, especially if audiences began linking their discomfort to the film's audio design. Internal communications recommended avoiding deep frequency saturation unless absolutely necessary. As theatrical sound systems improved, the potential volatility of these tones became more concerning. Playback inconsistencies between venues meant a scene that felt subtly tense in one theater could feel outright overwhelming in another. To mitigate risk, studios gradually stopped using persistent infrasonic beds in mainstream releases. THX 1138 remains a unique artifact, one of the few films to treat sound as an invisible force capable of reshaping bodily response. But its influence faded quietly, leaving behind a lesson Hollywood took seriously. The line between immersive sound design and physiological manipulation can be much thinner than audiences realize. 152001, A Space Odyssey 1968. When 2001, A Space Odyssey first appeared in theaters, audiences believed they were witnessing a bold artistic experiment. Few realized that Kubrick had inadvertently crafted one of the most aggressive perceptual stress tests ever shown publicly. The now iconic Stargate sequence was built through slit-scan imaging and analog color cycling that produced visual pulses far less controlled than modern digital equivalents. These pulses interacted with the eye's adaptation processes, creating a barrage of shifting luminance and geometry that destabilized depth perception. During early screenings, viewers reported sensations that seemed unrelated to the film's narrative. Some described a drifting feeling, as if the theater itself were shifting beneath them. Others felt emotionally detached or overwhelmed without understanding why. Medical professionals who viewed the sequence noted that the frequency of certain light transitions aligned with known triggers for sensory overload, though the terminology for such phenomena was still primitive at the time. Studio advisors grew uneasy. While the film's psychedelic reputation shielded it from controversy, internal discussions acknowledged the unpredictability of its visual rhythms. The analog process produced micro-flicker patterns that varied from print to print, meaning each screening could deliver a slightly different physiological impact. This variability made the technique impossible to regulate and therefore too risky for replication. As Hollywood moved into the digital era, the specific optical characteristics of the Stargate sequence became essentially unreproducible. Modern restoration has smoothed many of the rough edges, softening the effect that once pushed viewers toward perceptual vertigo. Yet the legacy remains clear. Kubrick demonstrated that cinema could tap directly into neurological thresholds without intending to. 2001 stands as a monumental achievement in filmmaking, but hidden within its brilliance is a technique the industry quietly chose not to revisit. It marked a moment when visual innovation crossed into biological influence and revealed just how thin that line could be. If these forgotten techniques show us anything, it's that cinema has always carried more power than audiences were meant to recognize. Light, sound, motion, each one capable of slipping past awareness and shaping perception in ways that leave no fingerprints. Hollywood may have buried these methods, but their legacy still lingers in old reels, abandoned test footage, and the quiet warnings of those who handled them. If you want to keep exploring the hidden machinery behind sci-fi's strangest moments, stay with Vaulted Futures. More suppressed experiments, more erased technologies, more secrets buried beneath the films you thought you knew still lie ahead.